The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as soldiers gathered around the mess hall tables, their voices echoing with laughter and casual chatter. Coffee cups clinked against metal tables, while the smell of breakfast filled the air. For the men of Charlie Company, this was just another ordinary Tuesday morning, filled with the usual complaints about cold scrambled eggs and weak coffee. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, grinning widely as he finished telling another joke about their previous commander, Colonel Henderson, who had been transferred to a desk job in Washington just 2 weeks earlier. The soldiers around him erupted in laughter, some nearly spilling their coffee as they doubled over with amusement. "I swear, that man couldn't find his way out of a paper bag with a map and a flashlight," Rodriguez chuckled, shaking his head. "Remember when he got lost during that training exercise and ended up in the neighboring county? We spent 6 hours looking for him while he was sitting in a diner eating apple pie." Private Johnson, barely 19 with freckles scattered across his face, wiped tears from his eyes. "And what about the time he tried to demonstrate proper combat tactics and ended up falling into that mud pit? He looked like a chocolate sculpture when he crawled out." The laughter grew louder as more soldiers joined the conversation, each adding their own memories of their former commander's mishaps. Corporal Davis slapped the table dramatically. "Or when he accidentally called for air support during a routine patrol because he pressed the wrong button on his radio. The pilots thought we were under attack and scrambled 2 helicopters for nothing." These soldiers had grown comfortable with the relaxed atmosphere that had developed over the past few months. Colonel Henderson, despite his many flaws and tendency toward confusion, had been a gentle leader who rarely raised his voice and often overlooked minor infractions. The men had learned to work around his shortcomings, essentially running the company themselves while maintaining the illusion that he was in charge. "I heard our new commander is supposed to arrive today," mentioned Private Thompson, a tall, lanky young man who always seemed to know the latest gossip. "Wonder what kind of pushover they're sending us this time." Rodriguez snorted with amusement. "Probably another old-timer looking for an easy ride to retirement. These brass hats are all the same. All talk and no action. They sit behind their desks, shuffle papers around, and pretend they know what real military life is like." The soldiers nodded in agreement, their confidence boosted by months of operating with minimal supervision. They had developed their own routines, their own way of doing things that seemed to work just fine without much interference from above. Morning formations had become casual gatherings, equipment inspections were perfunctory at best, and training exercises often turned into extended breaks in the shade. "As long as nobody gets hurt and we don't make the evening news, I figure we'll be left alone to do our jobs," Davis added, reaching for another piece of toast. "These commanders come and go, but we're the ones who actually keep this place running." The mess hall buzzed with comfortable conversation as soldiers discussed their plans for the day. Some talked about the poker game scheduled for that evening, others debated which movie to watch during their free time. The atmosphere was relaxed and friendly, like a group of friends hanging out rather than a military unit preparing for daily duties. Outside, the morning breeze rustled through the trees surrounding the base, carrying the sounds of normal military activity, vehicles moving equipment, the distant sound of training exercises from other units, and the occasional bark of orders from more disciplined companies. But inside the mess hall, Charlie Company remained blissfully unaware that their comfortable world was about to change dramatically. Private Wilson, a stocky young man with a thick Southern accent, leaned forward conspiratorially. "I heard from a buddy in communications that our new commander is coming from some fancy Pentagon assignment. Probably never spent a day in the field in his life. These Washington types are all the same, soft as butter and twice as useless." The soldiers chuckled knowingly, secure in their assumptions about military leadership. They had seen enough commanders come and go to feel confident in their ability to size up their new leader quickly. In their experience, most officers were either incompetent like Henderson or so focused on their next promotion that they ignored what was actually happening in their units. $10 says he shows up in a brand new uniform that's never seen a speck of dirt, Rodriguez wagered, standing up to refill his coffee cup. These Pentagon warriors always look like they stepped out of a recruiting poster, all shine and no substance. As the morning progressed, the soldiers gradually dispersed to begin their daily routines, but the casual atmosphere remained. Equipment maintenance was performed with minimal effort, training exercises were conducted at half speed, and regulations were interpreted creatively when they were followed at all. The men had grown accustomed to this relaxed environment and saw no reason why things should change with a new commander. Nobody noticed the black sedan that had pulled up to the base commander's office an hour earlier. Nobody saw the figure in crisp military dress uniform step out and walk purposefully toward the administrative building. The soldiers of Charlie Company continued their morning activities, completely unaware that their new commander had already arrived and was currently reviewing their personnel files with growing concern. In the administrative office, Colonel Sarah Mitchell sat quietly behind a desk, studying reports and evaluations with sharp, intelligent eyes. Her uniform was immaculate, her bearing confident and professional. She had spent the last 3 years commanding special operations units in challenging overseas assignments, earning a reputation for transforming undisciplined units into highly effective fighting forces. The reports in front of her painted a clear picture of a company that had lost its way, operating without proper leadership or accountability. Equipment readiness was below acceptable standards. Training scores had declined steadily over the past 6 months, and discipline issues were mounting. But Colonel Mitchell had seen worse situations and knew exactly how to handle them. As she prepared to meet her new command for the first time, the soldiers in the mess hall continued their jokes and casual conversation, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to descend upon their comfortable little world. Their laughter echoed through the building as they prepared for what they expected to be another easy day under weak leadership. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything they thought they knew about military command. The heavy wooden door of the mess hall swung open with a loud bang that cut through the morning chatter like a knife. Every head turned toward the entrance, expecting to see another soldier arriving late for breakfast, or perhaps one of the kitchen staff bringing out fresh coffee. Instead, they saw a figure that made the laughter die instantly in their throats. Colonel Sarah Mitchell stood in the doorway, her presence commanding immediate attention without saying a single word. She was not the soft, desk-bound officer they had been expecting. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, and her bearing spoke of years spent in real combat situations rather than comfortable Pentagon offices. Her steel-gray eyes swept across the room, taking in every detail of the scene before her. The soldiers froze in their seats, coffee cups halfway to their lips, jokes dying on their tongues. The casual atmosphere that had filled the mess hall moments earlier evaporated like morning mist, replaced by a tension so thick it seemed to press down on everyone present. Even the kitchen staff stopped moving, sensing that something significant was happening. Rodriguez, who had been mid-sentence in another joke about their former commander, found himself staring at this unexpected figure with his mouth still open. The confident smirk that had been plastered across his face slowly faded as he realized this was not what any of them had anticipated. Colonel Mitchell stepped into the room, her polished boots clicking against the concrete floor with military precision. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years in dangerous situations, always alert, always ready. Her gaze passed over each soldier, and they felt as though she was reading their personnel files simply by looking at them. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent mess hall. It was not loud, but it possessed an authority that made every soldier instinctively straighten in their chairs. "I am Colonel Sarah Mitchell, your new commanding officer." The silence stretched on uncomfortably as the soldiers struggled to process this information. This was definitely not the aging, incompetent officer they had been joking about just minutes earlier. Everything about her demeanor suggested competence, experience, and a no-nonsense approach to military leadership that was completely foreign to their recent experience. Private Johnson, who had been laughing so hard at Rodriguez's jokes that tears were still drying on his cheeks, now sat rigid in his chair, trying to make himself as small as possible. The freckles on his face stood out sharply against his suddenly pale complexion as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Colonel Mitchell continued her visual inspection of the room, noting the relaxed postures, the casual conversation that had been interrupted, and the general lack of military bearing that pervaded the atmosphere. Her expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes suggested she was cataloging everything she observed for future reference. I understand that some of you may have developed certain expectations about military leadership based on your recent experiences, she said calmly, her tone conversational but with an underlying edge that made everyone listen intently. I want to assure you that those expectations are about to be thoroughly revised. Corporal Davis, who had been so confident in his assessment of military commanders just minutes earlier, felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He had served under tough sergeants before, but something about this woman's presence suggested a level of professional competence that was completely beyond his experience. The colonel moved further into the room, her observant gaze taking in details that the soldiers had never considered important. She noticed the unfinished meals, the casual way equipment was scattered around, the general attitude of relaxation that spoke of months without proper supervision. Her trained eye cataloged uniform infractions, posture problems, and a dozen other issues that would need to be addressed. I have spent the morning reviewing your unit's recent performance reports, she continued, stopping near the center of the room where everyone could see her clearly. Training scores, equipment readiness, discipline records, physical fitness evaluations, the picture that emerges is quite interesting. Private Thompson, who had been so confident about the new commander being another pushover, now wished he could disappear entirely. The gossip network that had seemed so reliable suddenly felt like a massive intelligence failure. How had nobody known about this woman's background? How had they been so completely unprepared? Colonel Mitchell's eyes settled on Rodriguez, who had been the source of most of the morning's entertainment. Sergeant Rodriguez, I believe you had some observations about military leadership that you were sharing with your fellow soldiers. Perhaps you would care to repeat them for my benefit. Rodriguez felt his face burn with embarrassment as he realized that their new commander had likely heard everything. The jokes that had seemed so harmless and clever just minutes earlier now felt incredibly foolish and inappropriate. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself unable to form coherent words. I thought not, the colonel said mildly, but her tone carried implications that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. It seems that this unit has developed some interesting ideas about military discipline and chain of command during the transition period. The soldiers sat in stunned silence, beginning to understand that their comfortable world of minimal supervision and casual attitudes was about to undergo a dramatic transformation. Everything they had grown accustomed to over the past few months suddenly seemed questionable and potentially problematic. Colonel Mitchell clasped her hands behind her back, a gesture that somehow made her appear even more formidable. Gentlemen, I want to be completely clear about something. I have spent the last 3 years commanding special operations units in some of the most challenging environments the military faces. I have transformed undisciplined, ineffective units into elite fighting forces. I have dealt with soldiers who thought they knew better than their commanders, and I have consistently achieved results that exceeded all expectations. The weight of her words settled over the mess hall like a heavy blanket. These soldiers, who had been joking about soft Pentagon officers and incompetent leadership, now found themselves face to face with someone who represented everything they had not expected and were not prepared to handle. Private Wilson, whose southern drawl had been so confident earlier, now sat completely motionless, afraid that any movement might draw attention to himself. The casual observations about Washington types and recruiting poster officers now seemed incredibly naive and potentially dangerous to have voiced so openly. "This unit's performance over the past 6 months has been unacceptable," Colonel Mitchell stated matter-of-factly. "Training standards have declined, equipment readiness is below acceptable levels, and discipline has essentially disappeared. These issues will be corrected, beginning immediately." The soldiers exchanged nervous glances, finally beginning to understand that their assumption about getting another easy commander had been catastrophically wrong. The woman standing before them was clearly someone who took military standards seriously and had both the experience and authority to enforce them effectively. Colonel Mitchell's gaze swept across the room one final time, ensuring that every soldier understood the gravity of the situation. "We will be conducting a complete unit inspection at 1400 hours today. Full dress uniform, equipment displayed for review, barracks prepared for detailed examination. I suggest you use the intervening time wisely." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of activity from other parts of the base. The soldiers of Charlie Company sat frozen in their chairs, the reality of their situation finally beginning to penetrate their shocked minds. The afternoon sun blazed overhead as the soldiers of Charlie Company stood at rigid attention in the scorching heat, their dress uniforms already showing patches of perspiration despite their best efforts to maintain military bearing. The casual, relaxed atmosphere that had characterized their morning had been completely replaced by nervous tension and barely controlled anxiety. Colonel Mitchell moved slowly down the line of soldiers, her sharp eyes examining every detail of their appearance with methodical precision. She paused at each man, checking uniform specifications, equipment positioning, and overall military presentation. The silence was broken only by the sound of her footsteps and the occasional rustle of fabric as soldiers tried to maintain perfect posture under her scrutiny. Rodriguez stood sweating profusely, not just from the heat, but from the realization that his equipment was in far worse condition than he had remembered. The jokes about incompetent commanders seemed like ancient history now, as he struggled to keep his rifle properly positioned while the colonel examined his gear with professional expertise that revealed every shortcoming. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Colonel Mitchell said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "When was the last time this weapon was properly cleaned and maintained?" Rodriguez swallowed hard, knowing that his honest answer would reveal months of neglected maintenance. "Ma'am, it was approximately 2 weeks ago, ma'am." The colonel's expression didn't change, but she made a note on the clipboard she carried. "I see. And this equipment belt? When was it last inspected according to regulation standards?" The questions continued down the line, each one revealing another layer of neglect and casual attitudes that had developed under their previous commander's relaxed leadership. Private Johnson discovered that his uniform had multiple infractions he had never noticed, while Corporal Davis found himself unable to explain why his equipment inventory was incomplete. As the inspection progressed, it became clear that the unit's problems went far deeper than anyone had realized. Equipment that should have been replaced months earlier was still in use, training records were incomplete or missing entirely, and basic military standards had been ignored for so long that many soldiers had forgotten they existed. Colonel Mitchell completed her examination and returned to the front of the formation, her expression revealing nothing about her thoughts. The soldiers remained at attention, but their confidence had been completely shattered by the systematic exposure of their unit's deficiencies. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying a tone of professional disappointment that was somehow worse than anger would have been. "What I have observed today confirms everything I read in your performance reports. This unit has forgotten what it means to be soldiers in the United States Army." The words hit like physical blows, and several soldiers felt their faces burn with shame as they realized how far they had fallen from proper military standards. The comfortable assumptions they had made about their competence and the acceptability of their casual approach now seemed incredibly naive. "However," Colonel Mitchell continued, her tone shifting slightly, "I have seen units in worse condition than this one, and I have successfully transformed them into effective fighting forces. The question is whether you have the commitment and discipline necessary to meet proper military standards." She walked slowly along the front of the formation, making eye contact with each soldier as she spoke. "Over the next 3 months, this unit will undergo intensive retraining and reorganization. Every aspect of your military performance will be evaluated, corrected, and brought up to acceptable standards. Those who cannot or will not meet these standards will be transferred to other assignments more suitable to their capabilities." The implications of her words were clear, and several soldiers felt their stomachs tighten with anxiety. They had grown so comfortable with their relaxed environment that the prospect of real military discipline seemed both foreign and intimidating. "Training will begin at 0500 hours tomorrow morning," Colonel Mitchell announced. "Full field gear, weapons cleaned and inspected, physical fitness preparation complete. We will be conducting field exercises that will test every aspect of your military knowledge and capabilities." Private Thompson, who had been so confident about the new commander that morning, now realized that his information sources had failed him completely. The gossip network that had seemed so reliable had provided no warning about what they were actually facing. "Sergeant Rodriguez," the colonel said, focusing her attention on the soldier who had been leading the morning's entertainment. "You will report to my office at 1800 hours for a detailed discussion about leadership responsibilities and unit standards. Bring your training records and equipment inventory for review." Rodriguez felt his heart sink as he realized that his casual attitude toward his duties was about to be subjected to intense scrutiny. The jokes that had seemed so clever that morning now felt like evidence of his failure to take his responsibilities seriously. As the inspection concluded, Colonel Mitchell dismissed the formation with crisp efficiency, leaving the soldiers to contemplate the dramatic changes that awaited them. The comfortable world they had inhabited for months was gone, replaced by the prospect of real military discipline and professional standards. Over the following weeks, the transformation of Charlie Company was remarkable to witness. The soldiers who had been laughing and joking about weak leadership found themselves pushed to their limits and beyond. Training exercises that had become casual affairs were replaced by intensive professional military education that challenged every assumption they had made about their capabilities. Equipment that had been neglected for months was overhauled and maintained to perfect condition. Physical fitness standards that had been ignored were enforced with relentless consistency. Military bearing and discipline became not just expectations, but requirements that were monitored and evaluated continuously. Some soldiers initially resented the dramatic changes, longing for the easy days under their previous commander. But as their skills and confidence grew under Colonel Mitchell's demanding leadership, they began to understand the difference between real military competence and the comfortable mediocrity they had mistaken for acceptable performance. Rodriguez, who had been the source of so many jokes about military leadership, found himself developing into a competent, non-commissioned officer under the colonel's guidance. The casual attitude that had characterized his approach to leadership was replaced by professional competence and genuine concern for his soldiers' development. By the end of 3 months, Charlie Company had been transformed from a unit that barely met minimum standards into one of the most effective companies on the base. Their training scores improved dramatically, equipment readiness reached exemplary levels, and their reputation for professional competence became known throughout the entire installation. The soldiers who had been laughing that morning about incompetent commanders now understood that they had been fortunate to serve under a leader who demonstrated what real military excellence looked like. Their assumptions about military leadership had been completely revised through direct experience with someone who embodied the highest standards of professional competence. Colonel Mitchell's arrival had indeed changed everything, but in ways that ultimately made every soldier in the unit more capable, more confident, and more proud of their military service than they had ever imagined possible. The laughter had stopped that day, but it was replaced by something far more valuable: genuine respect for military excellence and the satisfaction of achieving standards they had never thought they could meet.